Descartes' bones have traveled now. They're disinterred, brought back to France. There's this dispute. They're buried at the church in Paris. They molder there for a while. Eventually, questions arise. We want to know, really, finally, are these his bones? There are questions of authenticity. So what do we find out in the end? And where are Descartes' bones and the various parts of his remains?
Okay, so the French Revolution, they're having this debate. Meanwhile, the mob is out there destroying churches, and the government is egging them on. Then this very interesting figure named Alexandre Lenoir enters the story, who was this little wisp of a man who was an artist, a lover of art, a lover of history and French history, and he had these kind of mystical ideas about all of that. And he saw all of these beautiful objects being destroyed, and he went to the revolutionary government and said, look, can't we preserve this, not for religious purposes, but for historical purposes? And so they said, okay, you do it. Go ahead. And they gave him an office, and they gave him a staff. And so he then went around. He would get the word, okay, this church is being destroyed. And he would go over there with his crew and save some monuments, and including tombs, and bring them back to this place along the river, which was a former monastery, appropriately enough. And including the church of Saint-Germain, the church of Saint-Geneviève. And so he goes there and digs around and brings back Descartes' bones to his depot. Then after a little while, he's got this massive amount of objects, and he gets an idea to turn it into something. And he creates the Museum of French Monuments, which is kind of maybe the first history museum, like a narrative history museum that tells the story chronologically of French history by means of all these relics. And he's got this garden in back, and he's this very sepulchral figure. And the garden in the back is all these tombs of Abelard and Eloise and Descartes. Right. And he writes a catalog for it. People come thronging to this museum. It becomes and it's strange to think of tourists during the French Revolution going to Paris, but they did. So this is what Lenoir does with it. And then the museum, he has all these plans for it, but then Napoleon comes along, and this was a revolutionary museum. And so the museum, the church comes back, and objects tend to go back. Meanwhile, Descartes, there was an urn that's left sitting there, forgotten. Then the next little part of the story is just down the river, just down the Seine a little bit, the French Academy of Sciences, which is the great august body of science and the arbiters of what science even is. They get word of the fact that Descartes, who they consider their great intellectual forebear, is lying, unceremoniously in a heap somewhere. And so they send a delegation, and they open this urn, and all they find are some moldering remains, and there's no head, there's no skull. So now, this takes us all back to what I was talking about before, when the skull went missing. So it happens that among these august men, of course they're all men, was a Swedish chemist named Berzelius, who was visiting Paris. He goes back to Sweden. He says, oh, too bad, interesting. He goes back to Paris, and 2 years later, he's reading a newspaper, and he sees that a scientist had died, who was actually his mentor, had died, and there was an auction of his effects, among which was the head of Descartes. So he goes, the head of Descartes was bought at auction by a casino owner, who bought it to decorate his casino.
It was not Steve Wynn.
No. And so he goes to the guy and convinces him that this is a worthwhile historical object and he should sell it to him. So he gets it and then sends it to Paris with a letter saying, look what I found. And so then there's this this great scene where you have all these, the learned scientists of the day surrounding this skull, and this is sort of, to me, metaphorically, it's kind of advancing. You're looking at the advancement of science by means of the bones, and these people who themselves were advancing science, so then they ask themselves a very scientific question: how do we know it's real? How do we know this is Descartes' skull? So then they start to investigate it, and it's by now it's a real object because it's been passed through all different hands in Sweden. There are people who wrote their names on it. There's a poem in Latin on it. There's indication of a theft on it. So they start doing digging. So they did digging, and then there's a guy, a 19th century Swedish medical doctor who made it his retirement project to do to trace what happened to Descartes' skull in Sweden, and then me, because then I went to his, where he left his papers at the University in Lund, and traced this. And what happened was when the remains were dug up in Stockholm, there was actually fear that people would steal them, and so they put a guard on them. The captain of the guard, a guy named Planstrom, took the skull and kept it. And then he gave it to his son, and then it passed down and went on and went through. And that has its own little trajectory. What the cousin of a man named Celsius, who was the cousin of the Celsius for whom the scale is named, had it for a while. And then it comes down, and then Berzelius gets it, and finally it makes its way back to Paris. And so they do this test basically about authenticity, provenance, trying to decide, is this legit? So once again, it's kind of the scientific method applied to the remains of Descartes. The man who is credited with the mind-body split. There was this literal mind-body split. So this is then what the Academy, then the question is, do we reunite the two or not? But being scientists, I guess they don't. They keep it in the science, and it's still now in the Musée de l'Homme, the anthropology museum in Paris, where the curator of the museum has been very kind to me. Can I go visit? Can I? Yeah.
You've held the skull of Descartes, yes? It's a modest skull. It's a small skull.
It's a very small skull, which is one of the reasons that they thought this may not be his. So one of the leaders of the Academy was a man named Cuvier, who was the great biologist of the day, who had a lot of important contributions to biology. But of course, then as now, good and bad science could go hand in hand. And Cuvier had a theory about skull size and skull shape correlating with intelligence. Larger skulls meant more intelligence, and shape also. And basically, his theory was that the shape of white people's skulls meant that they were inherently more intelligent than Africans. And Cuvier, so this is a few years later now, and Cuvier has examples to show, examples of great thinkers and their big heads. And then somebody remembers, wait a second, didn't we get, and so then they go and get Descartes' skull out of the collection. Yeah. It's this tiny little thing, and they say, aha, here's the intellectual father of the French nation with this little, so even there, I mean, Descartes' skull, Descartes' bones kind of are going to refute bad science.
Right.
The body, finally it gets put in the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, and that's where it's been ever since. And the current leading French Descartes scholar is also a Catholic priest, and in 2000 he said a mass over Descartes' remains there, so that is generally considered the resting place of Descartes' bones, and Descartes' skull remains in the museum on the other side of the river. Again, this nice split. However, according to my research, that's not where Descartes' remains are, and you can read the book if you want to know where they are.